Early 1948. Despite the presence of the British, the Jewish agency, led by David Ben-Gurion, asserted increasing military and administrative influence in Palestine. Jewish paramilitary forces included the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern Gang. During the first half of 1948, their numbers swelled to as many as 40,000 men and women. On the other side, there were as few as 3,000 Palestinian irregulars. This was the remnants of the fighting force smashed by the British after the Arab Revolt in 1936. There were also an estimated 4,000 volunteers from the region, known as the Arab Liberation Army, led by an Arab nationalist called Fawzi al-Kawukashi. In terms of fighters, the Palestinians were outnumbered and outgunned.
A small group of Zionist leaders and military commanders met regularly on a weekly basis from February 1947 to February 1948 for a whole year, planning the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. They didn't decide about it in a day. They had the weekly meetings, and in each week they became more and more convinced that this was the right way forward.
In the first week of 1948, hostilities picked up. There were 2 bomb attacks against Palestinian targets. The first, a car bomb, destroyed the old Ottoman government house in Jaffa. It killed 26 people. The second, the bombing of the Semiramis Hotel in Jerusalem, killed over 20. At Oxford University's Middle East Center, we found an important document. It contained details of a meeting on January 6, 1948, between the British High Commissioner for Palestine and David Ben-Gurion. The High Commissioner inquired about reports that Haganah was responsible for the attack on the Semiramis Hotel. Ben-Gurion conceded this might be the case. And in a letter he sent 2 days later, Ben-Gurion confirmed Haganah's responsibility for the attack. During the first 3 months of 1948, Jewish paramilitary groups carried out dozens of attacks on Palestinian cities and villages. Some operations were carried out by special units of Jews disguised as Arabs, known as Mistaravim.
اليهود صارت تطلع على القرى بالليل، فاهم؟ وتعمل تحط قنابل وتسووا انفجارات ولهذا. صرنا احنا ناخذ البارودة ونحرس خوفا من انه اليهود يدخلوا يعملوا هكذا.
A direct challenge to the United Nations and its powers of war prevention comes from Palestine. The definition of legal and illegal forces becomes daily more obscure. Haganah, the force first legally raised for the defense of Jewish settlements, appears to function hand in glove with Irgun Tzvi Leumi, the outlawed terrorist army.
The well-trained Jewish forces began to put their plans into action.
These days, criticizing Israel gets backlash like this.
When the ICC investigates Israel for fake war crimes, this is pure anti-Semitism.
From the river to the sea is anti-Semitic.
Those calling for a ceasefire are legitimizing anti-Semitism.
But here's the thing. Investigating Israel for war crimes or demanding a ceasefire in Gaza is not anti-Semitic, which is hatred of Jews. It's criticism of the state of Israel, and the two are not the same thing. So how did criticism of Israel and charges of anti-Semitism come to be interchangeable, and what have the consequences been? I spoke to 2 Jewish experts who work closely on the issue.
This has become a well-worn strategy of the Israeli government and its defenders to conflate all criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
That's Simone Zimmerman, who's with the Diaspora Alliance. It's an organization that fights anti-Semitism and its misuse.
It's an insult to Jewish history, and it cheapens the idea of what these words actually mean.
And this is Laura Friedman, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and a leading expert on Israel and Palestine.
So if you can't win the arguments over Israeli policy, you're going to have to just shut down the criticism of Israel. There's something so twisted about where we are today.
So how did we get here? Well, if you listen to the pro-Israel establishment and its supporters, you hear the conflation of 2 very distinct terms.
Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. period, full stop.
Anti-Zionism is the modern mutated form of anti-Semitism.
The high anti-Semitism now is anti-Zionism.
Okay, let's first unpack the definition of these terms. Anti-Semitism means hatred, prejudice, threats, and violence against Jews because they are Jewish. It's very real and it exists. Anti-Semitism in Europe is what led to the Holocaust, during which 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazis. Anti-Zionism, on the other hand, is the movement against Zionism. Zionism is an ideology that took root in the late 19th century among some Jews in Europe. It's the belief that Jews should have their own separate Jewish ethno-state, and it led to the creation of Israel in 1948, at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian population that lived there. Anti-Zionism challenges the very ideological basis of Israel as a nation-state. The movement existed decades before Israel, originally among Eastern European Jews who opposed Zionism's objective of moving Jews out of Europe.
The Zionist project to this day is built on an ideology of supremacy that provides exclusive and superior rights only for Jews. Anti-Zionism rejects that ideology of Jewish supremacy and seeks to dismantle it.
Now, it's important to note that not all Zionists are Jews. In fact, evangelical Christians are some of the most fervent Zionists in the world. It's a topic I reported on while in Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank. And just as not all Zionists are Jews, not all Jews are Zionists, although many are taught from a young age that supporting Israel should be part of their identity.
For me, growing up, being pro-Israel was a core part of my Jewish identity. I saw attacks on Israel as a personal attack.
For decades, there's been a concerted effort to collapse the distinction between the Jewish religion and Zionism. And that significantly ramped up in the 2000s after it became clear that Israeli leaders had abandoned all pretenses of seeking a political solution with Palestinians.
You can no longer with a straight face say that Israel really wants peace, they support a two-state solution, they don't want to oppress the Palestinians. That's where we saw the birth of this new definition of anti-Semitism.
That definition Laura's talking about is at the crux of this growing trend to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. It's known as the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. IRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
Who could be against an organization that's trying to remember the Holocaust and make sure people don't forget? That's a good thing.
You would think. But in 2016, the definition IRA published included 11 contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, 6 of which relate to Israel, including that it's anti-Semitic to claim that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Side note, Israel was created as a Jewish ethno-state, treating Jewishness as a race, violently expelling the Palestinian majority, and enforcing what even Israel's leading human rights organization calls an apartheid system. But the IRA definition won't have that.
The argument was made that all or most criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. We're going to put this in a definition. We're now going to take this definition and put it into law around the world. And we're going to use this as a blunt instrument to shut down once and for all these arguments. And that's where we are today.
At least 40 governments have adopted the IRA definition, as well as hundreds of universities and NGOs around the world, even as scholars and dozens of human rights groups like Amnesty International decry its implementation. That's because the IRA definition has been weaponized to silence criticism of Israel, curtail freedom of speech, and foster anti-Palestinian racism. A 2023 report found dozens of cases where IRA was explicitly used to target those advocating for Palestinian rights throughout Europe, even for something as simple as liking a social media post that condemned Israel's actions. And it's happening in the US too. The US House of Representatives passed a resolution in late 2023 that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism as defined by IRA. And the spirit of IRA is guiding organizations like the Pro-Israel Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, in how they track anti-Semitism. For instance, a recent ADL report found a huge spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the US after October 7. But when you dig deeper into the numbers, you find that 40% of those incidents were simply pro-Palestine rallies, many of which, by the way, were led by Jewish organizers.
An organization like the ADL have no qualms in just calling thousands of Jews anti-Semitic. The whole thing would be laughable if it weren't so insulting.
And the IRA definition is finding its way into laws. As of 2024, 4 US states explicitly have the IRA definition of anti-Semitism in their hate crime laws, with many more attempting to do so.
There's a reason why the people who want to shut down Palestine Voices, Palestine protesters, want the IRA definition in the hate crimes law. It's being used to attack Palestine Voices or pro-Palestine voices pretty much across every part of society.
And that's especially true on college campuses. U.S. universities have always been a place where anti-Israel speech has been curtailed. But in 2019, this practice of silencing pro-Palestine voices was legitimized when former President Donald Trump signed an executive order that enforced the IHRA definition on college campuses.
The biggest problem is a chilling effect. We see lawsuit after lawsuit and complaint after complaint targeting activists on campus, targeting administrators, targeting professors. We literally have cases based on somebody had a sign that said "River to the Sea," so you're claiming it's a hate crime.
By the way, it's worth noting that the guy who drafted the IHRA definition later spoke out against how it's been weaponized by the right-wing Jewish community, writing that using IHRA to define hate speech on campus is an attack on free speech and will not only harm pro-Palestinian advocates, but also Jewish students. Do you see this effort to silence any sort of criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic as harmful to Jews and dangerous?
Absolutely. I have no problem saying absolutely clearly it is anti-Semitic to conflate Israel and Jews. And the ADL and I agree on that. The problem is that what the ADL also say, if you don't conflate Israel and Jews, you're an anti-Semite. And that's incredibly dangerous because my argument, which says you shouldn't go out and target a Jewish kid because they're Jewish and hold them accountable for what Israel is doing, but you're simultaneously insisting that every Jewish kid on campus support for Israel and Zionism is intrinsic to their identity. You are effectively conflating every Jewish person with the state of Israel. That is incredibly dangerous.
And in the midst of all this, you have Israeli leaders promoting nationalist interests over fighting actual anti-Semitism around the world.
There's a history of Israeli government leaders actually playing down very dangerous forms of right-wing anti-Semitism because some of the very same people that promote that are allies of the Israeli government, who they see as part of building a world of racism and fear and division.
Take, for example, the far-right xenophobic Prime Minister of Hungary, or the Italian Prime Minister who herself was a member of a neo-fascist movement as a teenager, who have both found a friend in Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And of course, former President Trump, who courted white supremacists in his base and called neo-Nazi protesters very fine people. But Israeli leaders like Netanyahu give all of them a pass because they have the right view on Israel. And in the face of the very real threat of anti-Semitism perpetrated by white supremacists, we've also seen some Israeli leaders implicate Palestinians as a similar threat to Jews. In 2018, a white supremacist killed 11 Jewish worshippers at a Pittsburgh synagogue in what was the worst attack on Jews in U.S. history. But listen to how this Israeli leader, speaking to that congregation a few days later, seemingly equated the white supremacist perpetrator with Palestinians who had nothing to do with the attack.
From Sderot in Israel to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, the hand that fires missiles is the same hand that shoots worshippers. We will fight against the hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism wherever it raises its head.
He drew a direct line from the Pittsburgh shooter to Palestinian militants. There are real reasons why so many Jews are afraid for their own safety. And very often we see Israeli government leaders weaponize that fear and misdirect it at Palestinians. Palestinians are not responsible for the Holocaust. And yet the state of Israel repeatedly uses the memory of the Holocaust to stoke anti-Palestinian racism and to justify its actions against Palestinians.
And to shield itself from international law. When Israel was recently on trial for genocide against Palestinians in Gaza at the International Court of Justice, a court set up in the wake of the Holocaust to prevent the atrocities that Jews had experienced, many Israeli leaders accused the court of anti-Semitism.
The Hague hearing, it's a show of shame, hypocrisy, and blatant anti-Semitism.
The idea that the Israeli government is weaponizing the legacy of these international institutions to evade any consequences for the atrocities in Gaza, it's such a tragedy of history.
Anti-Semitism is a very real threat to the millions of Jews around the world. But advocating for a free Palestine, holding a pro-Palestine rally, or demanding Israel be held accountable for war crimes are not anti-Semitic actions. Saying they are only leads to dangerous trends, suppressing free speech, allowing Israel to evade accountability, and obscuring actual anti-Semitism.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a dominant political force in Israel and beyond, is at the center of multiple political scandals. Cases of corruption have come up against him and some of his closest advisors and confidants. Recently, police even recommended that Netanyahu be charged for his alleged involvement in 2 of the incidents. Even though Netanyahu has written these allegations off as a political witch hunt against him and fake news, we wanted to explore what these cases are all about in the first place. Hey guys, I'm Judah, you're watching Now This World, and today's episode, we're going to break down the 4 cases of alleged corruption against Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu and the people closest to him. Let's start with the first case called Case 1000. In this case, Netanyahu and his wife Sarah are alleged to have received almost $300,000 US worth of expensive gifts like fancy cigars and champagne, in exchange for political favors from businessmen over the span of 10 years. The 2 men who are said to be behind those alleged bribes are Israeli-born Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan, whose hit movies include Pretty Woman and recent Oscar winner 12 Years a Slave, and the Australian casino mogul James Packer. Israeli police claim that Milchan received a number of benefits for his gifts to Netanyahu, including the prime minister pushing for the passing of the so-called Milchan Law, which gives tax breaks to Israelis who want to return to Israel after living overseas, a law that would directly benefit Milchan, as the name of the law implies. Netanyahu is also accused of helping Milchan to get a 10-year visa to the United States, preventing the collapse of a television channel he had shares in, and even more. The other billionaire we mentioned earlier, James Packer, was a partner of Milchan, but police haven't said exactly how he benefited from the prime minister. Here's the thing. Netanyahu doesn't even deny receiving these gifts in the first place. He's told police that he has indeed been given these gifts from the billionaires, but he denies that favors were ever given in exchange for them. He says that the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gifts were just tokens of their friendship. In this case, police have recommended that Netanyahu be indicted for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. The next case is Case 2000. In this one, police say they have evidence that implicates Netanyahu in a conspiracy with Arnon Moses, the owner of the daily newspaper Yediot Achronot. Police say the 2 men agreed to a mutually beneficial relationship that was not in the public's best interest. Here's a little background information that's important to know. Moses' paper has historically been critical of Netanyahu. The 2 by no means, before this point, have been seen as close confidants of any sorts. Local media even report that behind closed doors, Netanyahu would refer to Moses as Voldemort. You know, that guy from Harry Potter? Now, back to what exactly was negotiated between the 2 men. Netanyahu reportedly had asked for more sympathetic coverage from Moses' paper. In return, Netanyahu would apparently push legislation forward that would hurt his competitor, Israel Hayom, which is widely seen as a pro-Netanyahu paper that also happens to be bankrolled by American billionaire Sheldon Adelson. Reportedly, police found audio recordings of this conversation on the phone of Netanyahu's former chief of staff, Ari Harrow. Harrow is now serving as the state's witness in this case against Netanyahu in exchange for a lighter sentence in his own case. The prime minister denies any wrongdoing here also. He doesn't deny that the conversations took place, but rather says that they were part of a plan to get incriminating evidence against Moses if he ever tried to blackmail Netanyahu. But police aren't buying that story. In this case, police have also recommended that Netanyahu be indicted for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Now, on to Case 3000. Netanyahu is not a suspect in this specific case, but a number of his top advisors are. So we'll just very briefly touch on this one. This case revolves around alleged corruption and bribery and the state purchase of German nuclear submarines. Police allege that some of Netanyahu's closest confidants used their influence to negotiate the deal and skim profits off the top. Here's the thing, Netanyahu's personal lawyer also represents the Israeli agent of the same German shipyard that makes the submarines. Police have not recommended that Netanyahu be indicted in this case. This investigation is reportedly still developing, so it's certainly one that we'll continue to watch moving forward. Now, the last corruption case so far, Case 4000. Some reports suggest that this case would be the most likely to lead to an indictment of Netanyahu. This case is centered around the allegations that Netanyahu used his influence to help his friend, Shaul Elovitch, the owner of Israeli telecommunications giant Bezek. According to state prosecutors, Netanyahu advanced regulatory benefits worth well over $200 million. In return, Elovitch's news site Walla would give Netanyahu favorable coverage. Both Netanyahu and Elovitch deny any wrongdoing in this case, but the man who ran Netanyahu's communications ministry tells a different story. In February, Shlomo Filbert signed a state witness agreement to work with prosecutors, And he accuses Netanyahu of directly ordering him to carry out the corruption scheme. Then, former Netanyahu family spokesperson and suspect in Case 4000, Nir Hafetz, also signed a deal to turn state's witness. As of the shooting of this video, police have not yet recommended that Netanyahu be indicted in this case. But what now? In addition to all of these cases, Netanyahu's wife Sarah is also likely to be indicted in her own scandal. She allegedly misused public funds to pay for private chefs and more. Despite whatever evidence is brought up, the decision whether the Netanyahus will be indicted on any of these cases lies in the hands of Attorney General Avicii Mandelblit, who was once a political appointee of Netanyahu. Despite their history, the Attorney General says he would not hesitate to indict Netanyahu if necessary. If he does move forward with the indictment, it could topple one of Israel's longest-serving prime ministers to date and have repercussions not only in Israel, but the entire region. The cases against the Netanyahus certainly aren't the only political scandals going on around the world today. So which ones do you want us to cover next? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching Now This World, and please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more like this every week.
You have been involved in several corruption cases. How much corruption is there in Israel? And how do you fight it in your own party and in Israel?
Well, you should ask a different question. What's happened to these cases? These cases have basically are collapsing, and before our eyes, there was recently an event in which the judges, the three judges in my case, called in the prosecution and said, your flagship, the bribery charge, so-called bribery charge, is gone, doesn't exist. Before a single defense witness was called, and it sort of tells you that this thing is evaporating. It's quite astounding. Even that, I have to say, was covered even by the mainstream press in Israel because it's such an earthquake. So, a lot of these charges are not a lot. These charges will prove to be nothing. I always said, listen, I stand before the legal process. I don't claim that I'm exempt from it in any way. On the contrary, I think the truth will come out, and it's coming out. And we see that not only that, but with other things. So I think it's kind of instructive that, no politician has been more vilified. None has been put to such a, what is it, about $250 million shekels were used to scrutinize me, scour my bank accounts, sending people to the Philippines, into Mexico, into Europe, into America, and looking at everybody using spyware, the most advanced spyware on the planet against my associates, blackmailing witnesses, telling them, think about your family, think about your wife, you better tell us what you want. All that is coming out in the trial. So I would say that most people now are not asking, are no longer asking, including my opponents. It's sort of trickling in as the stuff comes out. People are not saying, what did Netanyahu do? Because he apparently did nothing. What was done to him is something that people ask. What was done to him? What was done to our democracy? What was done in the attempt to put down somebody who keeps winning elections despite the handicaps that I described? Maybe we can nail him by framing him. And the one thing I can say about this court trial is that things are coming out, and that's very good. Just objective things are coming out, changing the picture. So I would say the attempt to brand me as corrupt is falling on its face. But the thing that is being uncovered in the trial, such as the use of spyware on a politician's surroundings to try to shake them down in investigations, put them in flea-ridden cells for 21 days, invite their 84-year-old mother to investigations without cause, bringing in their mistresses in the corridor, shaking them down. That's what people are asking. That corruption is what they want corrected.
No, Mr. Netanyahu, it is not anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas to point out that in a little over 6 months, your extremist government has killed 34,000 Palestinians and wounded more than 78,000, 70% of whom are women and children. It is not anti-Semitic to point out that your bombing has completely destroyed more than 221,000 housing units in Gaza, leaving more than 1 million people homeless, almost half the population. It is not anti-Semitic to note that your government has obliterated Gaza's civilian infrastructure, electricity, water, and sewage. It is not anti-Semitic to realize that your government has annihilated Gaza's healthcare system, knocking 26 hospitals out of service and killing more than 400 healthcare workers. It is not anti-Semitic to condemn your government's destruction of all of Gaza's 12 universities and 56 of its schools, with hundreds more damaged, leaving 625,000 students with no educational opportunities. It is not anti-Semitic to agree with virtually every humanitarian organization in saying that your government, in violation of American law, has unreasonably blocked humanitarian aid coming into Gaza, creating the conditions in which so many thousands of children face malnutrition and famine. Mr. Netanyahu, anti-Semitism is a vile and disgusting form of bigotry that has done unspeakable harm to many millions of people. But please, do not insult the intelligence of the American people by attempting to distract us from the immoral and illegal war policies of your extremist and racist government. Do not use anti-Semitism to deflect attention from the criminal indictment you are facing in the Israeli courts. It is not anti-Semitic to hold you accountable for your actions.
למקרה שלא ראיתם את המקרה של יובל דורון קסטלמן, אז מניח את האקדח על הרצפה. אז מסתבר שאז כן יורים ורוצחים.
Many people think of Israel and Palestine as two countries at war, with this one, a state for Jewish people, occupying this one here, where Palestinians live. The truth is, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians live all over this territory, ruled by one government and one army, based on the idea of
advancing the supremacy and domination of one group of people, Jews.
And that is what guides its policies and its practices towards Palestinians.
In other words, apartheid. Apartheid is a loaded word tied to the racist South African regime of white minority rule. But although the word comes from there, apartheid isn't just a description of what happened in South Africa. It's actually a crime against humanity under international law. In 2021, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of carrying out apartheid. It based this accusation on the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute, which say that 3 elements have to occur for the crime of apartheid to apply. They are an intent by one group to dominate the other, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts, like denying people the right to leave and to return to their country, expropriation of landed property, and the creation of separate reserves and ghettos. So let's see if any of these apply to Israel's rule over Palestinians.
About half of the people that live here under Israel's rule are Palestinian, and the other half are Jews, like myself.
For those 7 million Israeli Jews, almost the entire land is one space. Whether they're here, or here, they have the same rights, privileges, and legal status. They can move freely, vote in the same elections, and live under the same laws. The boundaries are invisible to them. But for the 7 million Palestinians, the boundaries are very visible. Whereas this is essentially one space for Israelis, Palestinians have been divided into 4 areas. Each area gets a different colored ID card issued by Israel, and your life and rights are determined by that ID card. In Gaza, Palestinians have no freedom of movement and are under a complete Israeli blockade. Israel no longer has soldiers inside Gaza, but it controls every aspect of life from the outside. People in Gaza have no civil or political rights. They've got no say in the Israeli government that controls them. Palestinians in the West Bank also have very limited freedom of movement, with their population divided into 165 disconnected cantons, cut off by Israeli military checkpoints, walls, settlements, and other infrastructure. They also have no civil or political rights in Israel. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians generally have more freedom to move, but Israel can take away their right to live in the city. They can't vote in Israeli elections, and Israel also bars them from taking part in Palestinian politics. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel can travel relatively freely, but they face restrictions on where they can live. They can vote in Israeli elections, but face legalized discrimination. Yara Hawari is a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship.
This ID system, it penetrates, all areas of life, where you live, where you study, what you work, etc. Even the more intimate areas of life, such as who you marry.
That's because for the most part, a Palestinian can't pass on their ID status to their spouse.
And this has huge implications on where they can live. Many indeed actually end up leaving and choosing to live abroad because it is that difficult.
On rare occasions, Palestinians are able to change their ID, but only in one direction.
So for instance, if a Palestinian from East Jerusalem moves somewhere else inside the West Bank, they could lose their residency in East Jerusalem. And Israel, since it's considered that a downgrade, then that's a direction that would be feasible. And further down the line, again, from Israel's perspective, if West Bankers move to the Gaza Strip, then that's a direction that Israel will accept, but not in the opposite direction.
So while Palestinians are granted different rights based on their IDs, nowhere do those rights match those of Israeli Jews. Looks like we can check off at least one of the elements required for apartheid to apply. When Israel was founded in 1948, 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been forced out. The result was that the new state had a Jewish majority. To maintain that majority, Israel has never allowed the refugees to return. The Palestinians who remained were given Israeli citizenship, although they were kept under strict military rule for 19 years. But in 1967, when Israel occupied more lands, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it faced a problem. It wanted the land, but didn't want the Palestinians on that land. So it's refused to extend citizenship to the rest of the Palestinians under its control, while keeping them under military rule ever since. To further control the ratio of Palestinians to Israeli Jews, Israel still bans Palestinian refugees and their descendants from moving into any of the territories it controls, while encouraging any Jewish person anywhere in the world to immigrate to Israel, even if they've never set foot there before. In Jerusalem, the Israeli authorities actually have a population target: 60% Jews to 40% Palestinians. Palestinians in Jerusalem are only granted a permanent residency permit, even if they've been living in the city since before Israel was founded.
About 350,000 Palestinians are in that status, and which is Orwellian, the way it's defined, because the only thing permanent in permanent residency is that it can actually always be taken away.
These permits can be revoked if a Palestinian moves out of the city, But Jewish Israelis living in Jerusalem never lose residency, even if they move to the other side of the world. This discrimination has been enshrined in Israeli law. The 2018 nation-state law says that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people and that the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. That means that even Palestinians with Israeli citizenship aren't considered equal to Jews with Israeli citizenship. As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put it, Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them. So let's go back to that list from before. The nation-state law is only one of many Israeli laws that explicitly discriminate against Palestinians. For example, there's the 1950 Absentees Property Law. Deeming Palestinian refugees absentees, Israel seized hundreds of thousands of acres of their land, even though they were only absent because Israel wouldn't let them return. Remember, denying people the right to return to their country is on the list of inhumane acts that legally make up the third element of apartheid. There are more Israeli policies that could fall under the category of inhumane acts, especially when it comes to land.
So Israel desires the land, even more so desires empty land or land that it makes empty, and doesn't desire the Palestinians living on that land. And that has resulted in policies in which land is constantly moving in one direction. Land that used to be Palestinian becomes state land, and then that land is allocated for the development of towns and communities for Jewish citizens.
And yes, expropriation of land is also an inhumane act. So let's see what that looks like on the ground. Across the entire territory, Palestinian communities are overcrowded and surrounded by Jewish-only communities.
It's the same type of practice of encircling Palestinian communities so that they can't expand, cutting them off from one another. It's a continuous practice that began in 1948 and was expanded to the West Bank in 1967.
The Israeli state prioritizes Jewish development in places where it wants to restrict the growth of Palestinian communities, with the government keen to Judaize areas like the Galilee and the Negev.
Israeli politicians frequently use that term to Judaize an area, in other words, to ensure Israeli Jewish dominance in a particular area, where the government has a concern over the Palestinian demography. And in any other context, this would be condemned as, gross ethnic engineering. It's in its basic laws, which is essentially the Israeli constitution. The land is deemed for the Jewish people, not the Israeli people, but the Jewish people.
In fact, only 3% of the land inside Israel's 1948 borders is allocated for its Palestinian citizens. Meanwhile, hundreds of new communities have been built for its Jewish citizens, many on the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages. Plus, there's the 200 illegal Jewish settlements that have been built across the West Bank as well. At the same time, thousands of Palestinian homes have been demolished or are under threat of demolition, having been built without permits because Israel rejects most Palestinian building applications. Meanwhile, in the Negev desert, the Israeli government wants to maximize the land available for Jewish development. So it has tried to force Palestinian Bedouin citizens into small townships by demolishing their homes and not allowing them to connect to the water and power grids. One village, El Araqib, has been demolished more than 180 times.
Now, just across the Green Line, a similar struggle is taking place in the village of Susia, which is in the West Bank, just south of Hebron. And it too has faced a series of mass demolitions by authorities in an attempt to establish Israeli Jewish control over the area.
Looks like we can check off another one of the criteria for apartheid. Israel has total control of this entire territory. Even in Gaza and the West Bank, which have some limited autonomous Palestinian administration in place, Israel controls the borders, trade, resources, water, electricity, the airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, the population registry, and more. Accusing a government of carrying out a crime against humanity like apartheid is no simple matter. But we've seen how Israel's control over and discrimination against Palestinians fits the legal threshold for apartheid. Israel's own leaders knew this was happening, although they didn't do much to stop it.
The state that you have at the moment is an apartheid state, isn't it?
It's not yet apartheid, but it might come on this slippery slope toward apartheid.
Still, how could apartheid apply to Israel when, say, Palestinian citizens can vote?
So, as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I cannot question the fundamental constitution of Israel, which says that the state is for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. My citizenship doesn't allow for inclusion in that state, and so therefore participation in Israeli elections or in the Knesset is really nominal and has no potential to change policy.
Another argument against the accusation of apartheid is that the occupation is only temporary, and when it ends, Palestinians will rule themselves.
Normal people don't think that 54 years is temporary. We've passed that line already a very long time ago. And yeah, there's a lot of Israeli propaganda insisting on that worldview of democracy plus temporary occupation. No, it's not a democracy and it's not a temporary occupation. It's one regime between the river and the sea, and that regime is apartheid.
Netanyahu wanted to provoke Iran. He wants to prolong this war as long as he can so that he can continue this slaughter of the Palestinian people. He knows very well that the first day of the end of this war, the last day of this war, will be the first day of the end of his political career. He knows he will go to jail because of 4 cases of corruption against him. He knows he will be investigated for the fact that he failed on the 7th of October, and now he's failing in this war. And this man wants to drag the whole Middle East into a terrible fight.
Thanks very much for joining me. I want to take a few minutes to discuss something that is not being discussed adequately in the corporate media, nor in Congress. And that is that right now, today, in Gaza, we are witnessing one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. It is unfolding before our very eyes, and we must not turn away from that reality. And I'm sorry to tell you what I think many of you already know, that we in the United States of America are deeply complicit in what is happening. What we do in Congress right now could well determine whether tens of thousands of people live or die. Let's briefly review what has happened in the last 4 months. On October 7th, Hamas launched a horrific terrorist attack that killed 1,200 innocent Israelis and took more than 230 hostages. More than 100 of those hostages are still being kept in captivity. That is what started this current war. And as I've said many times, Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas terrorism. But it absolutely does not have the right to go to war against the entire Palestinian people, and that, tragically, is what we are seeing. As of today, Israel's military campaign has killed more than 27,000 Palestinians and injured some 68,000, 2/3 of whom are women and children. Unbelievably, 1.7 million people have been driven from their homes, nearly 80% of the population. This is more than twice the population of my own state of Vermont. These people have no understanding as to where they will be tomorrow or whether they will ever return back into their communities. The devastation caused by Israeli bombardments is unprecedented in modern history. Some 70% of the housing units have been damaged or destroyed. Can you imagine that? The Israeli bombing attacks have destroyed most of the infrastructure in Gaza. There is no electricity and very little water. There are virtually no places to buy bread and basic necessities, as most of the bakeries have been destroyed or shut down. Raw sewage is now running into the streets, and communications are extremely difficult because there is little or no cell phone service available. Despite the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been injured, there are no fully functional hospitals in Gaza, and just 1 in 3 is operational at all. Amid repeated attacks on healthcare facilities, doctors and nurses are still bravely working to save lives, even without regular electricity or basic medical supplies. Israeli bombing and the onerous restrictions placed on aid entering Gaza mean that only a tiny fraction of the food, water, medicine, and fuel that is needed can get into Gaza. And even when supplies do get across the border, very little of that can reach beyond the immediate area around the Rafah crossing near Egypt. Let's take a deep breath and understand what all of this means for the men, women, and children who are in Gaza today. Not only have they been driven from their homes, not only have most of those homes been destroyed or damaged, not only are they unable to access the medical care or the clean water they need, but unbelievably and horrifyingly, hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza face starvation. Let me repeat that. Hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza face starvation. The UN says that 1 in 10 children under the age of 5 in Gaza is already acutely malnourished, and the entire population is at imminent risk of famine. What every physician knows is that malnutrition in small children causes permanent physical and cognitive damage. In other words, even if the war ended today, large numbers of children in Gaza will suffer permanent physical damage from what has happened in Gaza. And that's not to mention the extraordinary psychological damage that these children will suffer from as they have witnessed all of the death and destruction around them. If nothing changes, we will soon have hundreds of thousands of children literally starving to death before our very eyes. And believe it or not, the situation could even get worse. Right now, 1.4 million people, more than half of the population of Gaza, are squeezed into the area around Rafah, right up against the Egyptian border. Rafah was a town of just 250,000 people before the war. Now there are 1.4 million people there, more than 5 times the original population. These people are packed into crowded UN shelters or sleeping out in tents. It's a daily struggle for them to find food or water. And in the midst of all of this horror and suffering, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the leader of Israel's extreme right-wing government, has announced that Israel will soon launch a major ground offensive against Rafah, where 1.4 million people are located. What that means is Netanyahu will soon be forcing these desperate people to evacuate once again, and nobody has any idea as to where they will go. These families, already exhausted, traumatized, and hungry, will once again be displaced with no plan for how they will survive. I struggle to find words to describe this cruelty. And let me state once again that much of what is happening in Gaza now is funded by U.S. taxpayers. These are our bombs and our military equipment that is being used. We are complicit. This is not only an Israeli war, this is an American war. Prime Minister Netanyahu says that all of this is necessary. He says that Israel will only accept, quote unquote, total victory in this war. Yet asked recently what total victory would look like, he chillingly said that it is like smashing glass, quote, into small pieces, and then you continue to smash it into even smaller pieces, and you continue hitting them, end of quote. The question we must ask ourselves over and over again is how many more children and innocent people will be smashed in the process? And why is the United States helping to fund this humanitarian disaster? It is quite clear that beyond total destruction of Gaza, Netanyahu has no plan. This week, President Biden acknowledged the severity of this crisis. He said that Israel's response in Gaza, quote, has been over the top, end quote, and added that, quote, there are a lot of innocent people who are starving. There are a lot of innocent people who are in trouble and dying, and it's got to stop, end quote. That's President Biden. Well, he is absolutely right. It does have to stop. Then why in God's name are we now contemplating legislation that provides $10 billion more to the Israeli war machine to continue funding Netanyahu's war? President Biden and Secretary Blinken have been trying to negotiate an agreement where Israel pauses its military operation, Hamas releases the remaining hostages, and massive humanitarian aid comes in to help desperate people. We all hope that this deal comes together. But Netanyahu is resisting this proposal. In my view, he is trying to prolong the war to cling to power. Most Israelis rightly blame him for creating the crisis, and they want him out. But if Netanyahu prolongs the war, he can avoid accountability for his disastrous leadership. That is why Netanyahu is ignoring almost everything President Biden and Secretary Blinken are saying. He this week dismissed the hostage deal as delusional and brushed aside U.S. concerns about expanding the ground offensive to southern Gaza. There is a simple question that must be asked. How does it happen that, despite waging an horrific war which has caused massive suffering, despite ignoring the wishes of the President of the United States and the world community, how does it happen that the U.S. Congress is about to send another $10 billion of unrestricted military aid to Israel? No strings attached. It is beyond comprehension to me that Congress would reward Netanyahu even while he ignores everything the President of the United States says. Netanyahu is the leader of the most right-wing government in Israel's history, a man who has dedicated his political career to killing the prospects of a two-state solution. And yet this bill will give him a blank check paid for by the American taxpayer. It is hard to believe, but this is exactly what this bill will do. And what's even harder to understand is that in the midst of this horrendous humanitarian crisis, the legislation before us actually contains a prohibition on helping for UNRWA, the largest UN agency operating in Gaza and the backbone of the humanitarian aid operation. Israel's allegations against the agency are serious, and they are being investigated seriously. But you don't starve 2 million people because of the alleged actions of 12 UNRWA employees. The whole world is watching Netanyahu as he starves hundreds of thousands of children. We cannot be complicit in this atrocity. As long as this bill contains money to fund Netanyahu's war machine and this cruel war, it must be defeated. Thank you very much.
Now to the increasing crackdown on college campus protests nationwide. New York City police say they were called in to break up encampments at 2 different universities this morning, the New School and New York University, NYU. Administrators at both colleges said that protesters had broken school rules and defied orders to leave. Dozens of people were arrested. At nearby Columbia University, protesters chanted outside the residence of the university's president. Shame on you! Shame on you! Not only are protesters upset with Columbia's leadership, faculty are also exploring a possible no-confidence vote in the president of the school. And at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, protesters took their demonstration to the streets calling for a revolution. Joining me now, we have NBC News correspondent Maura Barrett. She's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and NBC News law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winters with us as well. Maura, I'll start with you. So university leaders at Wisconsin just wrapped up another meeting with leaders of the campus protests. Where do we stand?
Yeah, Kate, this is the second time that students and faculty affiliated with the demonstrations here have met with university officials, and it appears that talks may have stalled. Basically, we knew going into this morning that they had met yesterday. The university had promised that they would hold off from sending law enforcement in to clear the tent encampment that you see behind me. Today, we're learning protesters telling us that the university maintains that they want the tents off of campus. Reminder, there's a state law that says that you cannot camp on campus. The university is maintaining that the tents are not safe, and they did not expand on whether or not police would now come at any point today or over the weekend and clear out these tents. Students tell us that they're disappointed that the university is not making any movements on their demands to disclose their investments when it comes to the war, and they said that they plan on staying here until their demands are met. I spoke with Sarah, one of the protesters here, shortly after we got updates from the meeting to hear her reaction. I want to share that with you.
It's still disappointing that the university is kind of dragging their feet in the process. We know that the chancellor has the authority and the leverage to actually disclose information about what our tuition dollars are spent on, and she's choosing not to do that and instead deferring to different organizations and different lawyers.
Now, we reached out to the chancellor's office here on campus to get a response. We have not heard back from them yet or any confirmation of what was discussed in the meeting. But remember, on Wednesday, police came and there were severe clashes between protesters here and law enforcement. And so students say that they will maintain their presence here until their demands are met, but they're anxious about police presence coming in. Kate.
All right, Maura, thanks. Tom, let me bring you in. You know, let's just be honest. There are so many events going on all over the country, so many protests. We can't even report on all of them. When you speak to your law enforcement sources nationwide, what are they saying about the law enforcement responses here?
Exactly what you just said, Kate, in that idea that there's this migration of this. There's kind of a playbook at this point. We're seeing a lot of the same things. Thankfly, not the scenes that we're looking at right here out of Los Angeles, but we're seeing the same type of activity that we showed at the beginning, some of the work that the NYPD did earlier today at these encampments at NYU and the New School, where you have people camped out in tents, either inside or outside of these various institutions, protesting and basically setting up shop there. It's what we saw at Columbia University, and that has really migrated throughout the country. And it's interesting because it's not just East Coast and West Coast universities. It's not universities that are predominantly either liberal or conservative. We're seeing it really all throughout the country. So I think this is going to continue to play out up until a point, though, right? Because at some point, students will go home for summer vacation, summer internships and jobs. It'll be interesting to see, though, what happens when we get back in the fall, and if it's not just protests about things overseas, but maybe perhaps things here in the U.S.
Tom Winter, Maura Barrett, thanks to you both. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.
Any person who's a billionaire here, I don't know how many billionaires we have. Probably not too many, but you are aspiring billionaires, all right. But if you get there, you will be able to spend unlimited amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, supporting candidates you like or defeating candidates you don't like. That is not a democracy. That is a corrupt political system. It is no secret, therefore, that in the midst of all of this, we have lobbying groups like AIPAC and the far-right Christians United for Israel lobby, who are providing unquestioning support for Israel's right-wing government. They are spending enormous sums of money right now to influence our political system. Money, politics, foreign policy. Last election cycle, AIPAC's Super PAC spent over $30 million in dark money to oppose progressive candidates, many of whom I have personally worked with and supported, who spoke out in favor of Palestinian human rights. Instantly, that's all you got to do. Speak out in favor of the dignity, that's all, of the Palestinian people. And then you are on the AIPAC hit list, and you will be the recipients of large amounts of money trying to defeat you. And we have to acknowledge that AIPAC was successful in all but 2 of their races. The message was clear. If you criticize Netanyahu, you will be targeted. Meanwhile, because they are a bipartisan group, AIPAC not only contributes heavily to Democrats, but endorsed more than 100 election-denying, right-wing, pro-insurrectionist Republicans. This election, AIPAC is expected to spend approximately $100 million just to try to unseat progressive members of Congress who dare to speak out about what's going on in Gaza. So anyone who wants to talk about foreign policy, or for that matter, anything else that goes on in Congress, without recognizing the corrupt political system that we have and the impact that money has over what we do, really doesn't know very much about what's going on.